We will be picking back up on Bitten, The Secret History of Lyme Disease and Biological Weapons by Chris Newby. Chapter 12. Last interview, Hamilton, Montana, 2013. Adam PFC, or Private First Class Bradley Manning, was sentenced to 35 years in prison Wednesday after being convicted of espionage and other charges connected with a massive leak of classified material. USA Today, August 21st, 2013. I sat down next to Willie at a table in the center of an empty conference room at the Bitterroot Inn. I had thought it might be better to question him outside his home, without his wife listening in. We both faced a row of sliding glass doors that looked out on the jagged snow-covered mountains. It was negative 11 degrees Fahrenheit outside, with wind chill, and it didn't feel much warmer inside. I pulled out a folder of pictures and signaled to the student for hire video photographer to begin recording. I knew this was the last interview I'd get with Willie before his Parkinson's disease robbed him of his ability to speak. My last chance to convince him to share his secrets. Since Gray's interview 6 months ago, his health had degraded significantly. I took a few deep breaths to calm my nerves. Over the previous weeks, I'd settled on an interview strategy that I thought might work. I would engage the scientific part of his brain in answering my two questions: why the Lyme discovery files were missing from the National Archives, and why images of the organism labeled Swiss agent were located in the archive folders in the time frame where one would expect the Lyme disease spirochete pictures to be. Could this mysterious Swiss agent, which was never mentioned in any publications associated with the Lyme outbreak, also be a biological weapon? After a few warm-up sessions, I started asking specifics about the ticks and the patient blood samples collected around the time of the discovery. He told me that in late 1979, he had tested over 100 ticks from Shelter Island, located about 20 miles from the Lyme outbreak, and all but two had an unidentified rickettsial species inside. It looked like Rickettsia montana, now called Rickettsia montanensis, under a microscope, a non-disease causing cousin of the deadly Rickettsia rickettsii, but it was a different species. He said that a similar Rickettsia had also been found in Lone Star ticks, and that there was quite a bit of excitement over that discovery. I kept asking Willie about his mysterious Rickettsia, but his answers were garbled, and all I could glean from him was that he had stopped investigating it for reasons unknown. You say they're not looking for it anymore, I asked. They probably paid people off, he said. There are folks up there who have a way to enable that. Next I showed Willie an unlabeled image of a microbe and asked him what it was. That is a Swiss agent, said Willie. I asked him a series of questions on this microbe, and he recited what seemed like well-rehearsed lines. The Swiss agent is a Rickettsia montana-like organism found in the European sheep tick Isidos ricinus, and it doesn't cause disease in humans. I asked him why he brought samples of it from Switzerland back to his lab. He replied with the response that he often used when he seemed to know the answer but wasn't going to divulge it, ? I shifted to discussing the research he'd supervised at Naval Medical Research Unit 3 called NAMRU 3 in Cairo, Egypt, a facility that worked on tick and bioweapons-related research. I was doing things that the Nazis used to be doing, Willie said. What kind of stuff? working on the suspension for fleas, determining how many of the quantity of the generic materials, generic, determining how many of the quantity of the genetic material in fleas that could be used. Willie paused, unable to find the words to finish. So you're putting plague in fleas then? Yeah. What else were you doing, I asked. Increasing the fertility of female ticks to produce larger quantity of eggs. How would you do that? Play soft music? Pour them wine? Willie laughed and said, didn't find anything. Okay, who asked you to increase the fertility of ticks? He mumbled something I couldn't decipher and then said, the Russians. The Russians? Did the Russians ask you to do it? I said. Willie paused, then carried on. Apparently, it says so. We never know. I had no idea how to interpret that answer, so I continued. What else? Colorado tick fever virus, a mild disease. They found it produces a mild infection. If the virus was being developed as a bioweapon, it couldn't have been harmless. Its initial symptoms included fever, chills, headache, pain behind the eyes, light sensitivity, muscle pain, generalized malaise, abdominal pain, hepatosplenomegaly, swollen liver and spleen, nausea and vomiting, and a flat or pimply rash. Complications could include meningitis, encephalitis, and hemorrhagic fever, but these were rare. Still, it didn't sound mild to me. I asked him what the goal of these tests was. The virus lowers the antigen. Antigens are molecules on the outer surface of an invading microbe that the body recognizes as foreign, providing a signal that an invasion is underway. Theoretically, if a virulent bacteria's genetic code were mixed with a virus that causes a mild infection, or if both microbes were loaded into a single tick, physicians wouldn't recognize the physical symptoms of this novel infection, and it might not show up on standard antibody-based screening tests. I checked with Willie to see if my theory was correct. The virus lowers the antigen, so you can't test for it? That's it, he said. So are you saying if you infected an enemy population, they wouldn't be able to figure out what was wrong? Yeah. 2 hours into the interview, Willie started to freeze in the middle of sentences and slur his words, sign that his diabetes was out of control. I had to get him home for his insulin shot before he passed out. As we walked arm in arm across the hotel lobby, he described how it felt to have Parkinson's disease. I see a pebble on the sidewalk and I stop. My brain can't figure out how to walk around it. Ever the gentleman, he held the inn's front door open for me, even though he was wobbly. Outside, I was afraid he'd slip on the ice in the parking lot. After I dropped him at his home, I went back to the inn to review my notes and think about the interview. First, I drew some conclusions about his mental state. Though he was having trouble speaking and word finding, I didn't think he was delusional or making up things. My gut said that he truly felt a lot of unresolved guilt about bioweapons experiments he conducted, especially his work putting Colorado tick fever virus in ticks. Later, I reviewed the video many times and did my best to accurately interpret and transcribe what he was saying. It was frustrating, but he still wouldn't disclose key details on the who, what, and where of the alleged bioweapons accident. He offered me pieces of the puzzle, but for unknown reasons, he was holding back on the whole story. Was he worried about the legal ramifications of leaking the military information? Leaking this military information? During the summer of 2013, the plight of two high-profile whistleblowers, former CIA analyst Edward Snowden and ex-Army intelligence analyst Bradley Chelsea Manning, had been all over the news. Snowden was facing a maximum of 30 years in jail and fines for leaking classified intelligence and defense information. Manning had just received a 35-year prison sentence for providing more than 700,000 classified documents to WikiLeaks. Willie probably couldn't help noticing the message that came with these sentences: leaked classified information and you go to jail. All I could do now was run with the clues I'd been given: Swiss agent, Colorado tick fever virus, the mass production of ticks, and the Russians. I left the interview with verbal confirmations that Willie had worked with tick-borne bioweapons, but I still wasn't sure about the significance of the mystery rickettsia found in ticks during the Lyme outbreak. It could be that Willie truly believed that it was harmless to humans, and that's why he and his colleagues ignored its presence and kept looking for another cause. But Willie's body language made me think he was hiding something. I still needed someone or something to help me make sense of this story. Chapter 13, Rebellion, San Francisco, California, 2013. A good physician treats the disease. The great physician treats the patient who has the disease. Sir William Osler, co-founder of Johns Hopkins Hospital. Hundreds of protesters dressed in lime green clothes chanted on the median strip outside Moscone Convention Center in San Francisco, where the Infectious Disease Society of America, IDSA, was holding its 2013 meeting. They held up signs reading IDSA Reverse Lyme Guidelines, Do Not Harm, Stop Killing Lyme Patients, Stop the Denial of Chronic Lyme, and Chronic Lyme is passed to our kids. Shame on the Infectious Disease Society of America, IDSA, on a makeshift stage where Lyme patient speakers, singers, and rappers, a billboard truck circled the convention center for hours, emblazoned with the message: 300,000 plus people get Lyme disease each year, 100,000 develop chronic Lyme, don't deny it, treat it. Shortly after the convention began, the hall went dark. A fire alarm sounded, and two of the convention organizers were overheard saying that they thought that a Lyme protester may have pulled the alarm. A wave of mostly men in dark suits streamed out of the hall and onto the sidewalk. They found themselves face to face with the protesters. The stark contrast between the Infectious Disease Society dark suits and the protesters' lime green created the perfect visual metaphor for the Lyme Wars. On one side were the academic researchers, pharmaceutical companies, and government agencies, experts who said that the disease was typically mild and easy to cure. On the other side were the chronic Lyme disease patients and their doctors, who had experienced the tragedy of complex tick-borne infections. The IDSA guidelines, chronic Lyme isn't classified as an ongoing persistent infection. It's considered either as an autoimmune syndrome in which a body's immune system attacks itself, kind of like a cytokine storm, or a psychological condition caused by the aches and pains of daily living, or prior traumatic psychological events. These guidelines were often used by medical insurers to deny treatment, and many of its authors are paid consulting fees to testify as expert witnesses in these insurance cases. In some states, the guidelines recommendations take on the force of law, so that Lyme physicians who practice outside them are at risk of losing their medical license. The protesters were angry as a part of a 2008 antitrust settlement brought by Connecticut Attorney General Richard Blumenthal, now a senator. The IDSA guidelines were supposed to appoint an expert panel without biases or conflicts to do a re-review of the guidelines. In the settlement press release, Blumenthal had written, "My office uncovered undisclosed financial interests held by several of the most powerful IDSA panelists. The IDSA's guidelines panel improperly ignored or minimalized consideration of alternative medical opinion and evidence regarding chronic Lyme disease, potentially raising serious questions about whether the recommendations reflected all relevant science." In response, the IDSA leadership selected a review panel of doctors and scientists, and they determined that no changes or revisions to the 2006 Lyme guidelines are necessary at this time. Lorraine Johnson, JD, MBA, the Chief Executive Officer of LymeDisease.org and champion of the IDSA antitrust suit, maintains that the review panel was stacked with like-minded cronies of the original guideline authors and was therefore biased. She cites the recent article by research quality expert and Stanford professor John Ioannidis, MD, DSC, who recommends that professional societies should consider disentangling their specialists from guidelines and disease definitions and listen to what more impartial stakeholders think about their practices. Today, in 2019, these controversial guidelines are disputed tests. Today, in 2019, controversial guidelines and disputed tests are still influencing Lyme patient care. People often ask me why the IDSA and the CDC would support the problematic two-tier Lyme test. During my documentary research, I tried to get an answer to this question with a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request that solicited emails between 3 CDC employees, the IDSA guideline authors, For 5 years, the CDC strung me along with frivolous denials, unexplained delays, and false promises. In essence, the delays became an illegal off-the-books FOIA denial. Some delays were attributed to understaffing, year-end deadlines, and CDC personnel out for vacation. At one point, my unanswered calls were blamed on a phone dead zone in the CDC's new FOIA office. After the Lyme documentary Under Our Skin was released, I decided to double down on my efforts to dislodge the FOIA request. My congressperson sent several letters to the CDC. The director of the documentary wrote a letter to President Obama. The FOIA ombudsman in the Office of Government Information Services repeatedly pressured the CDC to fulfill my request. I published blog posts about my plight and enlisted the support of a number of organizations dedicated to ensuring government transparency. Finally, the CDC sent 3,000 plus FOIA pages, and I then understood its motivation for having delayed their release. The emails revealed a disturbing picture of a non-official group of government employees and guideline authors that had been setting a national Lyme disease research agenda without publishing oversight or transparency. Investigative journalist Mary Beth Pfeiffer of the Poughkeepsie Journal was given access to these emails, and on May 20th, 2013, she published an expose on this group's abuse of power. Bottom line, the guideline authors regularly convened in government-funded closed-door meetings with hidden agendas that lined the pockets of academic researchers with significant commercial interests in Lyme disease tests and vaccines. A large percentage of government grants were awarded to the guideline authors and/or researchers in their labs. Part of the group's stated mission culled from these FOIA emails was to run a covert disinformation war and a socio-political offensive to discredit Lyme patients, physicians, and journalists who questioned the group's research and motives. In the FOIA-obtained emails, Lyme patients and their treating physicians were called loonies and quacks by Lyme guidelines authors and National Institute of Health employees. Because my FOIA request ended up taking 5 years to process, Under Our Skin had been made and released without answering an important question. Were the government officials responsible for managing Lyme disease health policy being inappropriately influenced by outside commercial interests? Through my FOIA request, I found that a majority of the authors of the 2006 IDSA Lyme diagnosis and treatment guidelines held direct or indirect commercial interests related to Lyme disease. By defining the disease and endorsing tests or vaccines for which they were patent holders, they and their institutions made more money. Yet now Willie's confession had added another potential dimension to the story, another reason for the CDC to be undercounting Lyme cases. Maybe government officials knew that something else, a pathogen in addition to Borrelia, possibly a bioweapon, was causing the problems, and they wanted to keep a lid on it. On the side of the George R. Moscone Convention Center with electricity, I took a seat in a large hall to listen to a talk by Gary Wormser, MD, chair of the IDSA Lyme Guidelines panel. He was presenting on Borrelia miyamotoi, a tick-borne spirochete closely related to relapsing fever Borrelia. The bacterium, which was first discovered in Russia in 2011 and in the United States in 2013, caused flu-like symptoms that looked a lot like Lyme disease, usually without the rash. But there are no tests for it. Wormser spent a great deal of time discussing the nuanced and almost indistinguishable differences between the rashes caused by Lyme disease, Borrelia miyamotoi, Jesus. Another Lyme-like disease carried by Lone Star ticks. Then he opened the floor for questions. A young female physician walked up to a microphone. She introduced herself as Nevina Zubcevic, a clinician at Harvard Medical School, and began criticizing Wormser for obsessing over rashes. She said she had more Lyme patients than she could handle, and that frontline clinicians like her needed more research on treatments. There was stunned silence in the audience of about 300. A few words exchanged, and then Wormser asked for the next question. A tall, thin man sitting directly in front of me stood up and walked to the microphone. He said he worked on the Borrelia miyamotoi study too, and he added some details about the infection rates of ticks in California. Wormser looked flustered and apologized for not having mentioned the man as a collaborator. As the man turned around, I realized that he was none other than Alan Barbour, the University of California Irving professor who had helped Willie Bergdorfer isolate the first Lyme spirochete in Long Island ticks. Because Barbour had refused to be interviewed for the Lyme documentary, I knew that he might be the only chance I'd have to speak with him. I knew that this might be the only chance that I would have to speak with him. Later, I followed him down an escalator that overlooked a 2-story wall of glass with a full-frame view of protesters and watched him stare out at them for a few minutes. When he sat down in a row of folding chairs set up in the lobby, I approached him and introduced myself. Not realizing who I was, he invited me to sit next to him. "What do you think is really causing these chronic Lyme cases?" I asked. He let out a resigned chuckle. He'd been ambushed. Still, he replied politely, "We need to do more research to see what it really is." Then he mentioned a new study from a UC Davis professor who had found that Lyme-infected mice still had live spirochetes in them after taking a standard course of antibiotics. These were the first signs that the easy-to-treat, easy-to-cure mantra preached by the IDSA guidelines authors was being questioned from within the medical community. It was a start. Chapter 14, Smoking Gun, Orem, Utah, 2014. "I'll do anything you want me to do, but I won't watch you die." The Sundance Kid to Butch in the film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. As my plane approached the Salt Lake City airport, I looked out toward Emigration Canyon, at the bluff where Brigham Young, the leader of the Great Mormon Migration, staked a claim to the entire Salt Lake Valley for his religious followers. On July 24th, 1847, Young, weak from a bout of tick fever, lifted his head over the side of a sickbed wagon and gazed rummy-eyed out over the barren valley. Roomy, R-H-E-U-M-Y. Roomy-eyed over the barren valley. "It is enough. This is the right place," he said, and with that, his team of 148 pioneers began building what would become Salt Lake City, the world headquarters of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was familiar with the place because both my parents were raised as Mormons in Salt Lake City, and I had attended the University of Utah as an undergraduate. My father, Ronald Dale Bout, left Salt Lake City as soon as he graduated from college to pursue his boyhood dream of flying with the Navy. His father was a quick-tempered Dutch baker, and his mother was a career waitress. And my dad had been the first in his family to attend a university. That's where he met my mother, Sherilyn, who was studying interior design. I was born in Pensacola, Florida, just as my father was graduating from Navy flight school. I grew up as a military family nomad, living in 11 different places before I settled in California. I attended 3 different elementary schools and 3 different high schools. I was always on the outside of peer groups, an observer trying to decipher the unwritten rules of social groups, trying to fit in. Mostly, I turned to books and nature for companionship. In the course of my time working on the Lyme mystery, In the course of my time working on the Lyme mystery, I would twice visit Salt Lake City to review batches of Lyme discovery documents. It turned out that some of these research files hadn't been given over to the NIH archivist who came to collect them from Willie on March 5th, 2005. A temporary holder of these documents was Ron Lindorf, a 54-year-old entrepreneur and adjunct professor at Brigham Young University, and a Mormon father of 5 who lived in Orem, a suburb 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. A few years back, Lindorf had founded that then solid. Oof. A few years back, Lindorf had founded and then sold the largest market research data firm in the United States. Willie had called Lindorf several months prior to see if he'd be willing to submit his personal research papers to Brigham Young University's archive of rare and delicate materials of historical significance. Willie had heard from a mutual friend who advocates for Lyme patients that Lindorf would be a good steward for these papers. Lindorf was interested in anything that might accelerate Lyme disease cures for his son Justin, who had just been battling 3 life-threatening tick-borne microbes, Borrelia burgdorferi, Babesia, and Bartonella, which he had acquired while serving as a Mormon missionary in eastern Canada. One of the most frightening symptoms was uncontrollable fits of rage triggered by severe brain inflammation. Justin had been misdiagnosed for over 3 years. He almost died several times, primarily because he had a barely functioning spleen, the organ that filters out damaged blood cells and helps the body fight blood-borne infections. Now Lindorf was focusing all his energy and resources on fixing the biggest problem surrounding tick-borne diseases: ignorance. Excuse me. Lindorf and his daughter drove to Hamilton in 2014 and spent 2 days with Willie to determine which of his personal research materials to bring back to the university archive. When they arrived at his house, Willie took them back to a detached garage located on the far corner of a vacant lot next to his main house. The garage's roll-up door opened on the street around the corner from Willie's front door, and most people would assume that the garage was part of someone else's property. The garage was lined with bookcases packed with boxes of neatly labeled tick-borne disease article reprints, some going back to World War II. There were reference books from around the world, some in Russian, and there were file cabinets full of his lab notes, presentation slides, and a few old bottles of vaccines. Lindorf asked Willie why he didn't let the archivist take the garage files, and he said, "This was my work, all of my publications and studies." On the second day of the document sort, Lindorf slipped Willie a question on why the European strain of Lyme disease isn't as virulent as the American strain. He didn't answer right away, looking out at the garage window for about 10 seconds. His voice raised a few decibels when he said, "Well, you want to see bad? The Russians have it bad." "Why is the Russian strain bad?" Ron said. "Those damn Russians came and stole everything we were doing with it," he said, and threw up his arms in disgust. Lindorf and his daughter froze, too stunned to say anything. "I'm tired. I'm going back inside," Willie said, and left the garage. Later he told them that government officials had visited him twice to question him about the missing agents. Lindorf had heard about my investigation through a mutual friend, and soon after he called me to see if I wanted to review Willie's documents before they were sent to the university for archiving, in a process that can take months to years. So I booked a flight to Utah, bringing along my husband, Paul, to help photograph the documents. For 2 days, we dug through boxes of Willie's lab notebooks, slides, research reports, and a tattered brown file folder labeled Dietrich, 1954 through 1956. The folder was stuffed with faded carbon copies of letter documenting Willie's bioweapons work infecting fleas, mosquitoes, and ticks with lethal agents. There were reports on his plague-laden flea experiments, and they confirmed that Willie had told me in our last 2013 interview. And they confirmed what Willie had told me in our last 2013 interview. Letters and reporters detailed his efforts to infect mosquitoes to deliver lethal doses of the Trinidad agent, a deadly strain of yellow fever virus extracted from the liver of a deceased person. Lindorf had also found some deposit slips from 2 different Swiss bank accounts tucked into a stack of unrelated documents. The real smoking gun, though, was Willie's handwritten lab notes on the patient blood tests from the disease outbreak in Connecticut. These tests showed the proof of presence of what I named Swiss Agent USA, the mysterious rickettsia present in most of the patients from the original Lyme outbreak, a fact that was never disclosed in journal articles. It didn't take a PhD in microbiology to see that almost all the patient's blood had reacted strongly to an antigen test for a European rickettsia that Willie had called the Swiss agent. Even more surprising, all this work was done in 1978, about 2 years before Willie, the lead author, published the article reporting that a spirochete was the only cause of Lyme disease. After 2 days of intense document processing, Paul and I sat down with a glass of wine on the back porch of a tiny log cabin at the Sundance Resort. The land had been purchased by actor Robert Redford when he fell in love with it during the filming of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. We got a picture here. Willie's lab notes showed that a blood sera from steer Lyme patients tested strongly positive to the newly discovered European Swiss agent Rickettsia helvetica, not to 4 other common rickettsia known to cause disease in man, I guess. We sat there in heavy silence, listening to the burbling of a mountain stream in the ravine below. During that trip, we both had come to terms with the fact that Paul's Lyme disease symptoms had recently returned, and he'd have to get back into treatment. If that wasn't depressing enough, we had also just spent the day reading about the horrible bioweaponized germs that might be living inside us. As this worry churned in my head, we suddenly heard a loud thumping behind the cabin. Just then, 4 tattooed men, dressed in black, wearing Kevlar vests, carrying matte black automatic weapons, jumped out onto our porch. The front man, sporting a handlebar mustache straight out of a Hollywood Western, said, "Sorry, ma'am, we're just securing the perimeter. We're looking for an armed and dangerous fugitive." He showed me a smartphone photo of a scowling bald man with a tattooed tree stump of a neck and a soul patch on his chin. "He's a skinhead who escaped from prison," the posse leader said. Then the armed posse left as suddenly as it had appeared, and I thought about how surreal my life had become. The armed SWAT teams and bug-borne bioweapons were straight out of some B-movie script. It made me want to run into my rustic cowboy cabin, probably conceived by a Hollywood set designer, and hide under the red plaid flannel comforter. Where are we starting on this? Chapter 15, 8 Ball, Fort Detrick, Maryland, 2015. We pioneered We pioneers in science of aerobiology, which essentially was the study of survival properties and respiratory infectivity properties of pathogens in air, as we developed all the technology to do this. Edward W. Bud Larson, Fort Detrick's Aerobiology Division. It was a drizzly gray November day 2 months later when I stood at the base of the 8-ball, a rusty, welded steel sphere roughly the size of a hot air balloon sitting in the middle of Fort Detrick, also the National Cancer Institute. This was the original headquarters of the U.S. Offensive Biological Weapons Program. Beginning in 1951, this 1 million liter airtight chamber had been used to test munitions and study infectivity rates of aerosolized biological agents on animals and humans. From 1954 through 1973, about 2,300 Army volunteers found themselves behind the 8-ball in the program called Operation Whitecoat. Most of these test subjects were Seventh-day Adventists who, as conscientious objectors, had opted to participate in medical experiments in lieu of combat duty. None of them died during the tests, but a handful of participants reported having lingering symptoms. Armed with Willie's garage documents and details on the biological agents he was working with at Fort Detrick, I wanted to see if I could find an insider who had heard about open-air tests of these tick-borne microbes around Lyme, Connecticut. My tour guide was a highly decorated military scientist who used to work for Fort Detrick's U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, called RIID by the locals. Before I arrived, he had warned me that he was a bit eccentric, and I was not disappointed. He greeted me wearing khaki pants and a black boating blazer with white piping running along the lapel and bottom hem. It was a replica of the jacket worn by Patrick Magoon in the 1960s British cult classic TV series The Prisoner. For reasons of confidentiality, he asked that I refer to him as Number 6, Magoon's character in the series. I had met him via email a few months earlier through a guy who knows a guy, all members of an informal network of Cold War researchers. This personal tour of Fort Detrick had been Number 6's idea. At this point in our tour, we were checking each other out, deciding how much of our stories we wanted to reveal. Here's the 8-ball. Aerosolizing deadly pathogens at the National Cancer Institute. Standing next to the 8-ball, an earthbound submarine structure with a 1.25-inch thick steel wall, portholes, hatches, and pressure-tight doors, Number 6 began reciting the history of Fort Detrick with military precision. Before a devastating fire, the 8-ball had been enclosed within a building rigged with metal catwalks and ventilation systems. Volunteers sat around the perimeter lab with their face masks pressed against the sphere's rubber gasketed portholes, breathing the clouds of biological agents that were being evaluated for particle size, moisture level, temperature, and humidity. Afterward, physicians would monitor the volunteers' infectivity rates to study the progression of diseases and efficacy of vaccines and treatments. This was part of the rigorous process the Army used for developing a diverse portfolio of biological agents. It needed a mix of lethal and incapacitating ones, deployable for various climates and objectives. The Army's scientific director for this effort from 1956 to 1970 was microbiologist Riley D. Housewright. By the time President Nixon ended the offensive biological weapons program in 1969, Number 6 told me that Housewright had expanded the list of go-to biological agents to include anthrax, Bacillus anthracus, Q fever, Coxiella burnetii, Venezuelan equine encephalitis virus, and alpha virus, Brucellosis suis, and Tularmia, Frankicilla, Tularnarcis. Tularemia can be transmitted by ticks or from airborne particles. In an unpublished handwritten note, Housewright listed 28 agents that had been evaluated. After the tour, Number 6 invited me out for the best Chinese food in the state, which turned out to be a lavish buffet prepared by his wife, an immigrant from China. He had also invited 3 dinner guests, biodefense scientists and Cold War historians, members of what he called his brain trust. They were all retired government scientists who agreed to hear my story and help if they could. One was a USAMRIID epidemiologist. Why can't I say that word? Epidemiologist. There we go. Another was a fighter pilot turned scientist who had recently come out of retirement to deploy Ebola labs in Africa. The third was a virologist who did long stints in a Congo lab. In addition to having expertise in science, the 3 were all well-read in classics and history, able to quote Greek philosophers and historical military leaders with ease. As we sat down to dinner, Number 6's wife began covering the table with the Sichuanese dishes she'd been working on for days. Drunken chicken, mapo tofu, fish fragrant eggplant, boiled beef, pea cakes, Peking duck, jiaozi dumplings, and 3 kinds of pie. I've been working 3 days KP duty to help her prepare this dinner, said Number 6, referring to kitchen patrol military slang for food prep done by soldiers. During the evenings, I was impressed with the brain trust. Among other subjects they discussed, the Ebola outbreaks, technical details on why they believed that their colleague Bruce Evans had been framed as the anthrax mailer, and why the commercialization of the U.S. military was bad for the country. I described my investigation in open-air testing of live bacteria and asked for clarification on some of the technical aspects of Willie's research. I was a stranger, and they seemed guarded. No one knew of a military connection to Lyme disease, but it didn't seem outlandish to them that there could be one. I left Dietrich empty-handed and wondered if at the same time I was writing up my notes on them. The Brain Trust was filing a report on me. Driving back to D.C. in the pouring rain, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't know whom to trust anymore. Then a few days later, Number 6 sent me a published USAMRIID paper, Discernment Between Deliberate and Natural Infectious Disease Outbreaks. It provided me with instructions of sorts for fitting together all the pieces of the Lyme disease puzzle. And we'll pick up, where are we at? Chapter 16 tomorrow.